Thanks very much, Matthew. Now, I'd like you to please welcome Josh Frydenberg, our local member.
Well, thanks, Ken. Hard act to follow, a bit of power in that presentation. But to you and to Caroline, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's also a pleasure to join with you, Lane, whose company's at the cutting edge of a lot of these new technologies. And you, Matthew, and congratulations for all the work that you're doing, but also becoming acknowledged as the Young Environmentalist of the Year last year, which I think is a pretty significant achievement. I think we're fortunate to have him here. It's great to be back at Lighter Footprints. I think it's fair to say that Lighter Footprints and the coalition, my party don't always see eye to eye on every issue. But that's not to say this isn't a very constructive and healthy relationship, and these are very important debates that we need to be having. There's no more important debate in the public discourse at the moment, I think, than climate change, carbon tax, baseload power and the like. So I'm very happy to be here to contribute to the discussion and also to hear back from you, your feedback, particularly as so many people here are resident in the electorate of Kooyong. As for me, I spoke at a Lighter Footprints forum just before the last election, and I made it very clear that I'm a believer in climate change. I'm a believer that man contributes to climate change, and I believe in a cleaner, greener future, and I talked about that in my maiden speech, one where we can move to less energy-intensive industries. But the question for us as policymakers, as a public, is what are the most effective and most efficient means to get there? And I thought tonight I'd make 3 points. The first, and I really pay tribute to Beyond Zero Emissions for the work of obviously some really bright people at Melbourne University have got together. I had a look through today, part of that report, and while I think that moving to 100% renewable energy is certainly an ambitious and worthwhile goal, I think it's unrealistic in the short term, and I'll say why. The second point is, I think, and it was mentioned briefly in the introduction, that nuclear power is something that is controversial, particularly at present, but we as a country should have a frank and constructive bipartisan debate on it. And thirdly, how I think what some of the things that we are putting forward as a party about moving to more renewable energy and in the conjunction with some existing fossil fuel energy production, I think is going to get the balance right as we try to transition to a lower carbon economy. First, on my first point, Matthew talks about moving to 100% renewable in 10 years, and he does that. The solar thermal is 60% of the energy production on the base load, and wind turbines is 40%, and there's quite a lot of detail in that report. I think you talk about wind sites, 23 wind sites, 12 solar thermal sites. That's importing some of the, or making some of the best technology. It's a massive operation. They talk about in the report that it would require 8% of Australia's construction force to put together. But there's also another big factor in this, and that's the cost. And in the report, they talk about $10 billion a year, $37 billion a year over 10 years, $370 billion as being the price to move to this 100%, that were your numbers, Matthew, 100% renewable energy by 2020. And that's not taking into account any compensation for existing industries that, take the coal industry, for example, Australia's largest exporter, $55 billion a year. It's not taking into account a compensation package. So we have to think about what is going to be the cost. The second is the variability. One thing that solar and wind absolutely rely on is the weather. And there are real questions whether you can rely on those two forms of technology as baseload power. And I know in the report they talk about biomass, and we talk about hydro, which has an important part already in Australia's energy calculation. But there are legitimate questions there about whether that could be 24/7 baseload technology, principally around solar and wind. So I just want to place those two things there. The second issue, which is nuclear power, it's something that as said at the beginning, I believe we should have a constructive debate about it. It's not very popular at the moment, given what's happened in Fukushima in Japan. But I want to point out that that was 40-year-old technology. TEPCO, as the runners of that plant, were going to shut it down the year before and should have. And it also raises serious questions where you place nuclear power plants, given the instability in some regions. But just think about these numbers. Australia has 38% of the world's known uranium reserves. We export it to over 10 different countries. In the world, there are currently over 30 countries who are generating baseload power through nuclear. There are nearly 450 different reactors in the world, and there are another 55 on stream. In the European Union, 30% of their energy comes from nuclear power. In the United States, 20% of theirs. Some countries like France have more than 80% of their energy from nuclear power, and across the world it's 16% of the world's electricity. When we're talking about zero emissions or moving to carbon neutral world, nuclear power actually saves 2.5 billion tonnes of CO2 by virtue of the nuclear power's operation in the world. So I think we should at least be considering it, given its natural advantages, given our uranium reserves, and given, sure, you've had 3 Mile Island, you've had Chernobyl, and now you've had Fukushima, but there have been tens of thousands of safe nuclear reactor hours over that time that actually makes a case for why it is seen as, in a bipartisan way, as a way forward. And I say in a bipartisan way because you've got a Labor Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, you had one in Gordon Brown, who was a big advocate. You've got a Democrat President of the United States, Barack Obama, who's just issued $8 billion worth of loan guarantees for nuclear power. And then in Australia, you've got people like Bob Hawke who have said that it should be seriously considered. So it's not a partisan issue. Now, of course, there are going to be massive upfront costs. There's no doubt about that. And it's going to be cheaper to produce energy through coal. But as we transition to a lower carbon economy, this nuclear question will certainly be much more part of the equation. And the fact is that it's half the price that wind is in terms of getting started. And depending on what companies see as their rate of return on the capital that they invest and their sort of debt to equity ratios of their investments, that will have an impact on the cost effectiveness. Finally, I wanted just to talk about how we as a coalition are committed to a 20% renewable energy target by 2020, reducing emissions in the economy by 5% by 2020 on 1990 levels. And we're not doing that through a carbon tax, because we believe, and I'm probably a lone believer in this room, but we believe that that is going to be a punitive cost on the households, and it's not necessarily going to see the commensurate reduction in emissions that other technologies and other avenues provide. And a point to mention there, and we can have a debate about this, is we've seen electricity rises by nearly 50% in the last year or 2 years, and it actually hasn't seen demand change. And so the inelasticity of electricity is a relevant factor here. So what are we saying? We're saying, for example, solar. We talk about 1 million solar homes by 2020. We were introduced solar rebates when we were in government. We're a big believer in that. Trees, deforestation is responsible for 20% of the world's emissions. So we believe in planting tens of millions of trees. 3, carbon sequestration. It's not actually been part of any international agreement, but it will be part of an international agreement. Garneau, CSIRO, Wentworth have all talked about the benefits from carbon sequestration. You've also got a number of other things. How to use waste gas from coal mines, and how do you turn waste and emissions from Loy Yang into algae, and then into biofuels. These are all various ways that we can sort of look at in terms of taking it forward. There are vehicle standards, there are green buildings, there are landfills, there are all these issues. And finally, just to say, we are seeing an international debate on this issue. After Copenhagen, the next meeting is going to be in Durban at the end of this year. We've seen what the UK have done on their emissions targets, but they're a different economy, so we wait to see what happens at the end of the year. Thank you.